Veltar Crix adjusted his biosuit as he stood before the massive viewing screen in the Hegemony Command Center. The stars outside looked cold and distant, much like the expression on High Commander Zethmore's face. Veltar had been called to this meeting without warning, pulled from his routine analysis work on the outer colonies. Analyst Crix. The High Commander's voice echoed through the chamber. We have discovered a new species. Veltar's four eyes focused on the holographic display that appeared between them. A blue and green planet rotated slowly, showing continents and oceans. It looked peaceful enough, but Veltar had learned not to trust first impressions during his 20 cycles of service. The planet is designated Terra 3, Zethmore continued. The species calls itself humans. Our long-range scouts have gathered basic intelligence. They appear to be a young civilization, still using primitive technology. The hologram shifted, showing images of human cities, vehicles, and weapons. Veltar studied them carefully. The buildings were simple structures of metal and stone. Their vehicles moved on wheels or through the air using chemical combustion. Most interesting were their weapons, crude projectile devices that fired metal slugs using explosive powder. How primitive are we talking about, High Commander? Veltar asked, his analytical mind already working. They have not achieved faster than light travel. Their most advanced weapons are chemical explosives and kinetic projectiles. They still fight wars among themselves over resources and territory. Zethmore's mandibles clicked in what passed for amusement among their species. In many ways, they remind us of our own species several thousand cycles ago. Veltar nodded. This sounded like a routine observation mission. The Hegemony had encountered dozens of such species over the centuries. Most either joined willingly after seeing Hegemony technology, or were easily conquered if they proved hostile. Very few presented any real challenge to Hegemony expansion. Your mission, Zethmore continued, is to infiltrate their military structures and assess their combat capabilities. We need to know if they pose any potential threat to Hegemony interests, and how difficult conquest would be if they refuse peaceful integration. Understood, High Commander. How long do you expect this assignment to take? No more than a few cycles. These primitive species rarely have complex military doctrines. Gather basic intelligence on their weapons, tactics, and command structure. Use your standard infiltration gear and maintain regular contact. Veltar accepted the data pad containing his mission parameters. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. His cloaking technology would make him invisible to human detection systems. His biosuit would protect him from their environment and allow him to observe their activities without interference. 3 rotations later, Veltar found himself on the surface of Terra 3, hidden near what human communications identified as a military training facility. The gravity was slightly heavier than he was used to, and the atmosphere had an unusual smell, something the humans called fresh air. His infiltration had been flawless. Human technology was indeed primitive, unable to detect his advanced cloaking systems. The military base sprawled across several square kilometers of flat terrain. Humans in matching uniforms moved between buildings in organized groups. Veltar activated his recording systems and began documenting everything he observed. The first human to catch his attention was their base commander, Captain Lee Dae-ho. He was average height for a human, with dark hair and serious eyes. Veltar watched him review training schedules with his subordinates. The human's voice was calm and measured, showing basic leadership qualities but nothing exceptional. Veltar noted that Lee Dae-ho appeared physically unremarkable. Like all humans, he had no natural weapons, no claws, fangs, or armored skin. His body looked soft and vulnerable compared to most species in Hegemony space. Even Veltar's own people had hardened outer shells and retractable spines for protection. Next, he observed Sergeant Kim Bo-ra leading a group of soldiers through combat exercises. She was smaller than many of her male counterparts but seemed to command their respect. Her voice carried authority as she shouted instructions during their training drills. Move faster. The enemy won't wait for you to catch your breath. Kim Bo-ra's voice echoed across the training field. Veltar watched the soldiers run obstacle courses carrying heavy packs and weapons. They sweated heavily in the sun and many showed signs of exhaustion, but they kept going. This showed reasonable physical conditioning, though nothing that would threaten Hegemony warriors. The most interesting subject was Private Park Jinwoo, a young human who seemed barely old enough for military service. He was thin and often struggled to keep up with the physical demands of training. During weapons practice, his shots were less accurate than his peers. He appeared nervous and uncertain, traits that would be fatal weaknesses in real combat. Yet the other humans didn't abandon him. Instead, they helped him improve, sharing techniques and encouraging him during difficult exercises. Veltar found this behavior puzzling. In most military organizations he had studied, weak members were either eliminated or relegated to non-combat roles. As days passed, Veltar documented human military equipment and procedures. Their weapons were indeed primitive by hegemony standards. Their advanced rifles could barely penetrate basic hegemony armor. Their vehicles were slow and relied on fossil fuels. Their communication systems used radio waves that could be easily intercepted or jammed. Their tactics seemed overly complicated for such simple technology. They spent enormous amounts of time planning operations that could be solved with superior firepower. They emphasized teamwork and coordination rather than individual strength and advanced weaponry. Veltar also noticed something else about humans that struck him as odd. They seemed to form strong emotional bonds with each other, even with humans they had known for short periods. They shared personal stories, celebrated together, and showed genuine concern for each other's welfare. During one training exercise, Park Jin-woo injured his ankle during a long march. Instead of leaving him behind, his squad mates took turns carrying his equipment and helping him walk. This slowed down the entire unit and made them miss their objective timeline. When Captain Lee Dae-ho discovered this, Veltar expected punishment for the squad's failure. Instead, the captain commended them for not abandoning a team member. He said something about no one left behind being more important than completing the exercise on time. This made no tactical sense to Veltar. Sacrificing mission success for one weak individual went against every military principle he understood. Yet the humans seemed to consider this behavior admirable rather than foolish. After 2 weeks of observation, Veltar began preparing his preliminary report. The humans appeared to be exactly what they seemed, a primitive species with basic technology and overly emotional decision-making. Their weapons were ineffective against hegemony defenses. Their tactics were predictable. Their emphasis on protecting weak members would be a major disadvantage in real warfare. He recommended that the hegemony proceed with standard integration protocols. If the humans refused peaceful joining, conquest would be straightforward. A single hegemony battlecruiser could probably subdue their entire planet within a few rotations, but something nagged at Veltar's analytical mind. These humans had survived and thrived on a dangerous world filled with predators, natural disasters, and disease. They had built a global civilization despite their physical limitations. They had even begun exploring space with their primitive technology. Perhaps there was more to observe before making final recommendations. Veltar decided to extend his mission and watch these curious creatures a little longer. He had no idea that this decision would change everything he thought he knew about warfare, survival, and what made a species truly dangerous. The alarm bells shattered the peaceful morning at the human military base. Veltar watched from his concealed position as soldiers poured out of buildings, running toward defensive positions with practiced efficiency. What he had expected to be another routine training exercise was clearly something more serious. Captain Lee Dae-ho's voice boomed over the base communication system. "This is not a drill. We have hostile forces approaching from the eastern ridge. All units to combat positions immediately." Veltar adjusted his recording equipment and settled in to observe what he assumed would be a brief, one-sided engagement. The attacking force appeared to be local rebels or terrorists using the same primitive human technology. This would be an excellent opportunity to see how humans performed under actual combat stress. He expected to witness panic, confusion, and tactical breakdown. Most species showed their true nature when faced with real danger, and Veltar anticipated that human bravado would crumble when death became a real possibility. Sergeant Kim Bora took position behind a concrete barrier, her rifle ready. Around her, a dozen soldiers spread out in defensive positions. Private Park Jin-woo crouched nearby, his hands shaking slightly as he checked his weapon. The fear in his eyes was obvious, confirming Veltar's expectations about human weakness under pressure. The first explosions came from the eastern perimeter. Enemy mortars began falling around the base, sending chunks of concrete and metal flying through the air. Veltar watched for signs of human panic and retreat. Instead, something unexpected happened. Captain Lee Dae-ho didn't run for cover. Instead, he climbed onto an exposed observation platform to get a better view of the attacking forces. Enemy bullets whined past him as he calmly spoke into his radio, coordinating the defense. His voice remained steady despite the obvious danger. Enemy strength approximately 50 fighters with light mortars and automatic weapons, Lee Dae-ho reported. Kimbora, take your squad and flank left. Hit them from the north side while they're focused on our main defenses. Kimbora acknowledged the order and immediately began moving her soldiers away from their protected positions. Veltar watched in amazement as she led them across open ground that was under enemy observation. This was tactically insane. They were abandoning good cover to move through a kill zone. But the humans didn't seem to care about the danger. They moved quickly and efficiently, using whatever cover they could find. When Park Jin-woo stumbled and fell behind, 2 other soldiers immediately moved to help him without being ordered to do so. Enemy fire intensified as the attackers spotted Kim Bo-ra's flanking movement. Bullets kicked up dirt around the running humans, and Veltar saw at least 2 soldiers get hit. He expected them to retreat or surrender. Instead, the wounded humans kept fighting. Private Park Jin-woo, despite a bleeding arm wound, continued forward with his squad. When they reached their flanking position, he provided covering fire while medics treated the more seriously wounded. His earlier fear seemed to have transformed into something else entirely. Veltar watched in growing confusion as the human soldiers displayed behavior that contradicted everything he knew about combat psychology. When faced with superior firepower and defensive positions, most species either fled or fought desperately from cover until overwhelmed. These humans did neither. Medic Yoon Hye-jin ran between wounded soldiers under heavy fire, treating injuries while bullets flew around her. When Captain Lee Dae-ho ordered her to fall back to safety, she refused. "I have wounded soldiers here, sir," she replied calmly over the radio. "I'm not leaving them." She continued working on a soldier with a chest wound while enemy mortars exploded nearby. Her hands remained steady as she applied bandages and administered medicine. When shrapnel from a near miss cut her face, she simply wiped away the blood and kept working. On the other side of the battle, explosives expert Choi Min-ho volunteered for what appeared to be a suicide mission. The enemy had set up a machine gun position in a concrete bunker that was holding up the entire counterattack. "I can get close enough to place charges," Choi Min-ho told Captain Lee Dae-ho, "but I probably won't make it back." Lee Dae-ho considered this for a moment, then nodded. "Do it." Veltar expected this to be an empty gesture. Most species would volunteer for dangerous missions but find excuses to avoid actually carrying them out. Instead, Choi Min-ho immediately grabbed a pack of explosives and began crawling toward the enemy position. The human moved like a predator, using every rock and depression for cover. When he was spotted, enemy fire concentrated on his position, but he continued forward. Veltar watched him place the charges and arm the timer, all while bullets struck the ground around him. The explosion that followed eliminated the machine gun position and most of the defenders inside it. Choi Min-ho had somehow made it to minimum safe distance before the blast, though he was clearly injured by debris. But the most disturbing thing Veltar observed wasn't individual acts of courage. It was how the humans adapted their tactics in real time without waiting for orders from their commanders. When the original flanking plan was blocked by enemy reinforcements, Kimbora's squad automatically shifted to a different approach. They began moving through a drainage ditch that hadn't been part of the original plan, coordinating their movements through hand signals when radio communication became difficult. Park Jin-woo, despite his obvious fear and injury, started providing sniper support from an elevated position. His earlier poor marksmanship during training seemed to vanish under combat conditions. Each shot found its target with deadly precision. The human soldiers anticipated each other's actions and covered each other's movements without being told to do so. When one squad ran low on ammunition, soldiers from other units automatically began sharing their supplies. Most shocking of all, the humans seemed to get more dangerous as the fight continued, not less. Their initial fear transformed into something that made Veltar's combat analysis systems struggle to categorize. They weren't fighting to survive, they were fighting to win. The battle lasted 3 hours, When it ended, the attacking force had been completely destroyed or had fled. The humans had taken casualties, but nothing that crippled their fighting capability. As the soldiers regrouped and treated their wounded, Veltar noticed something else disturbing. They weren't celebrating their victory or resting after the intense combat. Instead, they were already preparing for the next attack, improving their defenses and analyzing what they had learned from the engagement. Captain Lee Dae-ho gathered his squad leaders for an immediate after-action review. What worked? What didn't? How do we do better next time? They discussed the battle like scientists analyzing an experiment, identifying weaknesses and developing improvements. Veltar realized that these humans treated every combat engagement as a learning opportunity, constantly evolving their capabilities. Private Park Jin-woo, who had seemed so weak and unsuited for combat just hours earlier, was now helping to plan defensive improvements based on his observations from the sniper position. His suggestions were taken seriously by more experienced soldiers. Medic Yoon Hee-jin continued treating wounded soldiers, while simultaneously training other soldiers in advanced first aid techniques. She was sharing knowledge gained from treating combat injuries under fire. Sergeant Kim Bo-ra was already modifying the base's defensive plans based on how the enemy had approached and where their attacks had been most effective. She wasn't just thinking about this battle, but preparing for future ones. As night fell and the base settled into defensive watches, Veltar found himself deeply troubled by what he had witnessed. These humans had displayed combat capabilities that his preliminary assessment had completely missed. They didn't fight like any species in hegemony records. Their tactics were flexible and adaptive. They used their apparent weaknesses as tactical advantages. Most importantly, they seemed to become more dangerous when under pressure, not less. Veltar realized that his initial report to the hegemony had been dangerously incomplete. These humans weren't the simple, primitive species he had first thought. There was something about their approach to warfare that made them far more dangerous than their technology suggested. He decided to delay his final report and continue observing. But a growing sense of unease told him that what he was learning about humans might change everything the hegemony thought. It knew about conquest and warfare. The humans had just given him his first real glimpse of what they were capable of, and Veltar was beginning to understand that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. 3 weeks after the first battle, regional tensions exploded into full-scale war. Veltar found himself following Captain Lee Dae-ho's unit as they were deployed to increasingly desperate situations. Each engagement revealed new aspects of human warfare that challenged everything he thought he understood about military capability. The latest deployment took them to a contested city where enemy forces had surrounded and cut off a civilian population. Standard military doctrine would call for airstrikes or artillery bombardment to clear the area before ground forces moved in. The humans chose a different approach. "We go in on foot," Captain Lee Dae-ho announced during the mission briefing. "Civilians are mixed in with enemy fighters. We extract the non-combatants and eliminate hostile forces with minimal collateral damage." Veltar watched from his concealed position as the human soldiers prepared for what appeared to be an impossible mission. They were outnumbered, operating in unfamiliar urban terrain, and tasked with protecting civilians while fighting an embedded enemy force. Any rational military commander would request reinforcements or heavy weapon support. These humans simply checked their equipment, reviewed their maps, and prepared to enter a death trap with nothing but their basic weapons and determination. The urban combat that followed defied every tactical principle Veltar had ever studied. Sergeant Kim Bo-ra led her squad through the city's underground tunnel system, moving beneath enemy-controlled streets. They navigated sewers, maintenance tunnels, and subway lines with maps that were weeks out of date and potentially compromised. "Watch for improvised explosives," Kim Bo-ra whispered as they moved through a flooded drainage tunnel. Enemy forces have been mining these passages for days. Despite this knowledge, the humans continued forward. They couldn't abandon the civilians trapped above, so they accepted the risk of moving through potentially deadly terrain. Private Park Jin-woo had been assigned as the squad's forward scout, a role that would have seemed impossible for him just months earlier. Now he moved through the dangerous tunnels with confidence, using skills that seemed to have developed through pure necessity. When they encountered their first enemy checkpoint, Park Jin-woo demonstrated abilities that shocked Veltar. The young human waited motionless in a flooded tunnel for over 2 hours, barely breathing until enemy guards became careless. Then he eliminated 3 armed fighters in complete silence using nothing but a knife and his bare hands. Above ground, Captain Lee Dae-ho coordinated a complex rescue operation while under constant sniper fire. Enemy forces controlled the high buildings and had clear sight lines down most streets. Moving in the open should have been suicide. Instead, the humans turned the urban environment into a weapon. They moved through buildings rather than streets, cutting holes between walls and creating their own passages. They used reflective surfaces to spot enemy positions without exposing themselves. They created false targets and diversions that drew enemy fire away from civilian evacuation routes. Most impressively, they seemed to communicate without using radios that could be intercepted. Hand signals, coded markings, and even the way they positioned their equipment conveyed complex tactical information between units. Medic Yoon Hye-jin set up a field hospital in a partially collapsed basement, treating both wounded soldiers and injured civilians. When enemy forces tried to target the medical facility, she refused to move. Wounded people can't be transported safely under this fire, she told Captain Lee Dae-ho over a crackling radio connection. We hold this position until we can stabilize the critical cases. She performed surgery by flashlight while explosions shook dust from the ceiling above her. Her patients included enemy fighters who had been captured or abandoned by their own forces. She treated them with the same care as her own soldiers, and the civilians they were trying to rescue. Veltar realized that humans had a concept called medical neutrality that prevented them from killing wounded enemies who were no longer fighting. This seemed tactically foolish. Eliminating enemy combatants permanently would prevent them from returning to battle later. But he began to understand that this wasn't about tactics. It was about something humans called principles, rules they followed even when those rules made their military objectives more difficult. The siege continued for 6 weeks. Enemy forces had superior numbers, better defensive positions, and external supply lines. By all logical analysis, the humans should have been overwhelmed within days. Instead, something extraordinary happened. The humans began to adapt to urban warfare faster than their enemies could counter their tactics. Kim Bora's squad became experts at building-to-building movement, creating passages and routes that existed only temporarily before being abandoned for new ones. They turned the city's infrastructure into a constantly changing maze that confused and frustrated enemy forces. Park Jin-woo developed into a sniper whose skills seemed impossible given his earlier poor marksmanship. He could wait motionless for hours in uncomfortable positions, then make precise shots through tiny openings between debris and rubble. But the most unsettling development was how the humans began to use psychological warfare. They started leaving behind evidence of their presence that was designed to disturb and intimidate enemy forces. Enemy fighters would find their supply caches opened and redistributed to civilians, but with no signs of how the humans had accessed them. Captured enemy equipment would be returned modified in subtle ways that made it unreliable without being obviously sabotaged. Enemy forces began to lose confidence in their own weapons and supplies. Most effective was how the humans used their own apparent vulnerability as a weapon. They would deliberately expose themselves to enemy fire in ways that appeared desperate or foolish, then use enemy responses to gather intelligence or lure fighters into prepared ambush positions. Veltar watched Captain Lee Dae-ho coordinate a rescue operation that required him to walk openly down a street while enemy snipers had clear shots at him. The human commander used himself as bait, drawing sniper fire that revealed enemy positions to his hidden soldiers. When enemy fighters moved to eliminate what appeared to be a foolishly exposed target, they found themselves caught in crossfire from positions they hadn't detected. Lee Dae-ho's apparent tactical mistake had been a carefully planned trap. The humans had turned their own limitations into advantages. Their small size allowed them to move through spaces that larger species couldn't access. Their apparent weakness made enemies overconfident and careless. Their emotional bonds with each other motivated tactical decisions that more rational species wouldn't consider. Most disturbing to Veltar was how the humans seemed to thrive under pressure. The more desperate their situation became, the more creative and dangerous their responses. When cut off from supply lines, they improvised weapons and equipment from materials found in the urban environment. When outnumbered, they created force multipliers through terrain modification and psychological operations. When facing superior firepower, they developed tactics that made enemy advantages irrelevant. Intelligence Officer Nam Soo-jin appeared during the 5th week of the siege, attached to Lee Dae-ho's unit as a liaison with civilian authorities. Veltar was immediately suspicious of her presence. She seemed too calm and observant. For someone in her first combat deployment, his suspicions proved correct when she approached his concealed position during a quiet night watch. "You can come out now," Nam Soo-jin said quietly, speaking directly toward Veltar's hiding place. "We've known you were there for quite a while." Veltar's cloaking system should have made detection impossible with human technology. The fact that she had not only found him but approached alone suggested capabilities that his intelligence had completely missed. "My name is Nam Soo-jin," she continued. "I specialize in xenobiology and first contact protocols. We've been wondering when you were going to introduce yourself." Veltar remained motionless, hoping his equipment had somehow malfunctioned, and she was just guessing at his location. But Nam Soo-jin pulled out a small device that began displaying readings that clearly showed his biosignature. "We reverse engineered this from some equipment that fell off a scout ship about 6 months ago," she explained casually. "Took our scientists a while to figure out how your cloaking technology works, but once we understood the principles, building a detector was relatively simple." She sat down on a nearby rock and continued talking as if this were a normal conversation between friends. "The interesting question is why your people sent someone to observe us. We're obviously a primitive species with no faster-than-light travel and weapons that would barely scratch advanced alien technology. Why would we be worth studying?" Veltar's analytical mind raced through the implications. The humans had captured hegemony technology, reverse-engineered it, and were actively preparing for contact with alien species. They had known about his presence for weeks but hadn't killed him. Instead, they had been studying him just as carefully as he had been studying them. "Don't worry," Nam Soo-jin said. "We're not going to hurt you. We're curious about your species too. This is probably the beginning of a very interesting relationship." As the siege finally ended with complete human victory, Veltar realized that everything he thought he knew about these creatures. Veltar found himself in an underground facility that officially didn't exist on any human maps. The walls were lined with technology that looked suspiciously similar to hegemony designs, though clearly modified and improved in ways that shouldn't have been possible for a supposedly primitive species. Colonel Jang Min-sik sat across from him at a simple metal table. The human commander looked tired but not unfriendly, as he reviewed a file that contained far more information about the hegemony than any primitive species should possess. "Veltar Crix," the colonel read from his notes. "Intelligence Analyst, Hegemony Expansion Division, assigned to Preliminary Threat Assessment of Terra 3. 23 cycles of service, specializing in pre-contact military evaluation." Veltar's biosuit had been removed, leaving him exposed, but surprisingly comfortable in the controlled environment of the facility. The humans had provided accommodation for his atmospheric and nutritional needs, with an understanding of alien biology that suggested extensive prior research. "How long have you known about the hegemony?" Veltar asked, his voice carrying a mixture of resignation and professional curiosity. Colonel Jang smiled. "Longer than you might think. We've been tracking your scout ships for about 2 years now. Your people aren't as stealthy as they believe when they're dealing with a species that's been watching the stars and expecting visitors." Dr. Shin A-young entered the room carrying a collection of data tablets and what appeared to be artifacts of unknown origin. She was younger than the colonel but carried herself with the authority of someone whose expertise was crucial to the discussion. "Mr. Veltar," she said, settling into a chair beside the table, "I'm a xenobiologist, but my real specialty is understanding how different species approach warfare and conflict resolution. I'd like to show you something that might help explain why your people's assessment of humanity has been incomplete." She activated a holographic display that showed a timeline of human history stretching back thousands of years. Veltar watched in growing amazement as the display revealed an almost continuous pattern of warfare, conflict, and military innovation spanning millennia. "Your species sees our current technology and assumes we're primitive," Dr. Shin explained, "but you're missing the larger context. Humans have been fighting wars for our entire recorded history. We've been testing tactics, strategies, and technologies against each other for thousands of years. The timeline showed human conflicts of every scale and type: small tribal raids, massive continental wars, technological revolutions driven by military necessity, and social changes forced by the demands of survival and competition. Every human conflict has been preparation for a larger conflict, Colonel Zhang added. We've never had the luxury of assuming we were the strongest species on our world. We've always been fighting someone or something that might destroy us. Veltar studied the historical data with growing concern. The humans hadn't developed their military capabilities in response to external threats. They had evolved as a species shaped by constant warfare and competition. Your people conquered the galaxy by being superior to everyone you encountered, Dr. Shin continued. But you did this by overwhelming primitive species or those who had become peaceful through prosperity. You've never faced a species that evolved specifically to fight opponents stronger than themselves. She showed him records of human military doctrine that had been developed over centuries. Every tactical manual, strategic planning guide, and weapons development program was designed around the assumption that humans would be fighting a superior enemy. We don't plan to fight equals, Colonel Zhang explained. We plan to fight opponents who are bigger, stronger, more advanced, and better equipped than we are. It's the only type of warfare we've ever known. Veltar absorbed this information with growing alarm. The hegemony's entire expansion strategy was built on technological and numerical superiority. They had never encountered a species that had spent millennia developing tactics specifically designed to defeat superior opponents. Dr. Shin activated another display showing human industrial and technological capabilities that had been carefully hidden from hegemony observation. Our primitive technology is intentionally simple and robust, she explained. We build weapons and equipment that can be manufactured quickly, repaired easily, and operated by anyone with minimal training. We learned long ago that complex technology becomes a liability when you're fighting for survival. The display showed manufacturing facilities, research laboratories, and training centers that were concealed throughout the human world. Instead of a few centralized military installations, humans had distributed their capabilities across thousands of locations that would be impossible to eliminate with conventional attacks. We also don't have a unified command structure in the way your people understand military organization, Colonel Zhang added. Every human government, military unit, and civilian organization is capable of independent operation. Destroying our capital cities or command centers would inconvenience us, but it wouldn't stop our resistance. Veltar realized that the hegemony's standard conquest protocol would be completely ineffective against humans. Their strategy relied on identifying and eliminating central leadership, after which most species would surrender or collapse into ineffective chaos. Humans had no central leadership to eliminate. But the most important thing you need to understand about humans, Dr. Shin said, is that we actually enjoy fighting superior opponents. We find it challenging and interesting in a way that might seem insane to your people. She showed him records of human recreational activities, sports and entertainment that all centered around competition and simulated conflict. Even their children played games that taught tactical thinking and competitive strategy. Your people see our willingness to fight against overwhelming odds as a sign of desperation or stupidity, Colonel Yang observed. But for humans, facing a superior enemy is exciting. It's an opportunity to prove that intelligence, determination, and creativity can overcome brute force. Private Kang Donghyun entered the room carrying a meal tray for Veltar. The young soldier moved with the easy confidence of someone who had seen combat and survived. When he set down the tray, he paused to look at the historical displays. "Is this the alien who's been watching us?" he asked casually. "Yes," Colonel Zhang replied. "Veltar, meet Private Kang. He was at that first battle you observed." Kang smiled and extended his hand in what Veltar had learned was a human gesture of friendship. "That was a good fight. We learned a lot from it. Are there more of your people coming?" The casual way the human soldier asked about potential invasion showed a mindset that Veltar found deeply disturbing. Kang wasn't afraid of superior alien technology or overwhelming numbers. He was interested in the tactical challenge they would represent. Private Kang represents something you need to understand about human psychology, Dr. Shin explained after the soldier left. "We've been hoping to find worthy opponents among the stars. Our own conflicts have become somewhat predictable after millennia of fighting each other. She showed Veltar intelligence reports that detailed human preparations for eventual contact with hostile alien species. They had developed contingency plans for dozens of different invasion scenarios, including many that anticipated facing hegemony-level technology. We've been preparing for this war longer than your people have been aware of our existence, Colonel Zhang said. Every human government has been briefed on probable alien contact scenarios. Our military forces train regularly for combat against hypothetical enemies with advanced technology. Veltar studied the detailed invasion response plans with growing horror. The humans had anticipated almost every aspect of hegemony military doctrine and developed specific countermeasures for each threat. Your people's greatest advantage is your assumption that technological superiority guarantees victory, Dr. Shin observed. But humans have been defeating technologically superior enemies for our entire history. It's what we do. The colonel activated a final display showing current human military deployments and capabilities. Veltar saw a global network of hidden installations, disguised weapon systems, and military units that had been completely invisible to hegemony surveillance. We've been allowing your people to observe carefully controlled demonstrations of our capabilities, Colonel Zhang explained. Everything you've reported to your superiors has been accurate but incomplete. You've seen exactly what we wanted you to see. Now, Dr. Shin added, we'd like to offer you a choice. You can return to your people and deliver whatever report you think is appropriate, or you can remain here as our guest while we prepare for what's coming. What do you mean, what's coming? Veltar asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Colonel Zhang smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. We know the hegemony will attempt conquest regardless of your report. It's what your people do. We've been preparing for that invasion since we first detected your scout ships. The only question, Dr. Shin added, is whether your people will receive accurate intelligence about what they're going to face, or whether they'll go into this war with the same assumptions that have served them against every other species they've encountered. Veltar stood once again before High Commander Zethmore in the Hegemony Command Center. But everything had changed since his last briefing. The data pad in his hands contained information that would fundamentally challenge everything the hegemony believed about conquest, warfare, and their own invincibility. Analyst Crix, the High Commander's voice carried the same cold authority as before. Your mission was scheduled for completion several cycles ago. What is your assessment of the human threat level? Veltar activated his presentation display, knowing that what he was about to say would sound impossible to commanders who had never encountered a species like humanity. High Commander, the humans represent a threat level unlike anything in our historical records. I recommend immediate suspension of all expansion activities in their sector and the implementation of long-term containment protocols. The silence in the command chamber was deafening. Admiral Thexran, the hegemony's chief military strategist, activated his own display showing standard threat assessment categories. Analyst Crix, Admiral Thexran's voice carried clear skepticism. You're describing a primitive species with chemical propulsion, projectile weapons, and no faster-than-light capability. How could they possibly represent a significant threat to hegemony forces? Veltar had anticipated this question, but explaining the reality of human warfare to beings who had never encountered it was like describing color to creatures that had never developed sight. Admiral, human military doctrine is based on defeating superior opponents. They have spent thousands of years developing tactics specifically designed to overcome technological and numerical disadvantages. He showed recordings from the urban siege, highlighting human adaptability and tactical innovation under extreme pressure. Their apparent technological limitations are actually strategic advantages, Veltar continued. Simple weapons are easier to manufacture and harder to disable with electronic countermeasures. Distributed command structures eliminate single points of failure. Their entire civilization is designed to continue fighting even after suffering catastrophic losses. High Commander Zethmore studied the combat footage with growing interest. These tactical adaptations show reasonable intelligence, but they hardly constitute a serious threat to hegemony battle groups. Our energy weapons would eliminate their defensive positions within minutes. That's exactly what they're counting on, High Commander. Veltar activated another display showing human military preparations that had been hidden during his initial observations. They've been preparing for this specific type of engagement for years. The holographic display revealed the true extent of human military capabilities. Hidden manufacturing facilities, underground command centers, and concealed weapons systems that covered their entire planet in overlapping defensive networks. They allowed me to observe training, exercises, and limited conflicts while concealing their actual capabilities, Veltar explained. Everything I initially reported was accurate but incomplete. The humans have been managing the intelligence they allowed me to gather. Admiral Thexeron dismissed the display with an impatient gesture. Analyst Crix, even if the humans have hidden capabilities, they remain bound by the limitations of their technology. Energy shields, faster than light travel, and gravity manipulation are beyond their reach. No amount of tactical innovation can overcome fundamental technological gaps. Veltar felt a growing sense of desperation as he realized his superiors were making the same assumptions that had proven disastrous throughout human history. Admiral, I've observed humans defeat superior opponents repeatedly by making technological advantages irrelevant through tactical innovation. They don't try to match their enemies' capabilities. They find ways to make those capabilities useless. He showed examples of human tactics that had neutralized technological superiority in their own historical conflicts. Guerrilla warfare that made air power ineffective, electronic warfare that disabled advanced systems, psychological operations that caused enemies to defeat themselves. These patterns suggest they would implement similar strategies against hegemony forces. Veltar continued, our weapons are more advanced, but humans would find ways to prevent us from using them effectively. High Commander Zethmore exchanged glances with Admiral Thexran before responding. Your concerns are noted, Analyst Crix, but they appear to be based on overestimation of primitive tactical adaptations. The hegemony has successfully conquered 17 different species in the past century alone. None have presented significant resistance once confronted with superior technology. High Commander, Veltar tried one more approach. The humans are different from every species we've encountered. They've never known peace. They've never assumed they were the dominant force on their own planet. Every aspect of their civilization has been shaped by constant conflict. Admiral Thexeron activated the fleet deployment schedules. Preparation for the Terra 3 operation will proceed as planned. Standard conquest protocols will be implemented. We anticipate complete planetary surrender within 3 rotations of initial contact. Veltar watched in horror as invasion preparations moved forward despite his warnings. The hegemony was about to encounter something unprecedented in their expansion history, and they were approaching it with assumptions that would prove fatally flawed. Surveillance Officer Quindar approached with updated intelligence reports from long-range monitoring stations. His expression carried an urgency that immediately caught Admiral Thexeran's attention. Admiral, Quindar began, we're receiving new data from the Terra 3 system that suggests significant changes in human activity patterns. The display showed orbital movements and energy signatures that hadn't been present during Veltar's mission. Human spacecraft were moving between their planet and their moon with frequency that suggested massive industrial operations. They appear to be constructing something in lunar orbit, Quindar reported. Power signatures indicate manufacturing facilities and what might be weapon systems, though their exact nature is unclear with current sensor resolution. More troubling were the energy readings from the human planet itself. Industrial activity had increased dramatically, and new installations were appearing in locations that had previously shown no development. Time frame analysis suggests these preparations began shortly after Analyst Crix completed his mission. Quindar added, it's as if they knew we would be returning. Admiral Thexran studied the new data with growing concern, but his confidence in hegemony superiority remained unshaken. Accelerated industrial activity suggests they're aware of impending contact, he concluded. This confirms the need for swift action before they can develop more advanced defensive capabilities. Veltar realized with growing dread that his superiors had learned exactly the wrong lesson from the new intelligence admiral. He tried once more. The humans have been preparing for this confrontation for years. They're not scrambling to develop defenses. They're implementing plans that were already in place. The invasion fleet launch proceeded on schedule despite Veltar's warnings. 3 battle cruisers, 12 support vessels, and enough ground forces to subdue a typical resistant population departed for the Terra 3 system. Veltar remained behind at Hegemony Command, assigned to monitor communications from the invasion force and provide analysis as the operation proceeded. He found himself in the unique position of knowing more about the enemy than the commanders who were about to face them. The first reports from the fleet were routine. Faster-than-light transit proceeded normally, and initial scans of the Terra 3 system showed expected human activity patterns. Fleet Commander Nextar reported confidence in mission success and anticipated minimal resistance. Then the communications stopped. For 6 cycles, Hegemony Command received no word from the invasion fleet. Long-range sensors showed energy signatures consistent with combat operations, but specific details were impossible to determine across interstellar distances. When communication finally resumed, Fleet Commander Nextar's report shattered every assumption the Hegemony held about human capabilities. Command, this is Fleet Commander Nextar. We have encountered significant resistance. Human defensive capabilities far exceed intelligence estimates. They have weapons that can damage our shields and tactics that neutralize our technological advantages. The transmission was interrupted by sounds of explosions and emergency alarms. They're not fighting the way we expected, Nextar's voice continued. They're using our own momentum against us, turning our advantages into liabilities. Recommend immediate reinforcements and complete revision of engagement protocols. High Commander Zethmore demanded detailed reports, but subsequent communications from the fleet became increasingly desperate. They've somehow infiltrated our command systems, one report stated. Our own weapons are being turned against us. They're inside our ships using tactics we've never encountered. Human forces are operating in areas that should be impossible to reach, another communication reported. They appear to be using our technology against us more effectively than we can use it ourselves. The final transmission from Fleet Commander Nextar contained a message that would haunt Veltar for the rest of his life. The humans weren't defending their planet. They were studying us,